Greetings and welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Chris L. Firestone and this is the Firestone Files. Over the past few months, we've been on quite a journey together, meeting the Firestones and celebrating the life of Charlie Kirk. And now, as we enter December, we embark on something new, a special series I'm calling Descartes December. All through this month, barring any festive detour, we will turn our attention to one of the most significant figures in Western thought, Rene Descartes. Across 5 episodes, I'll guide you on an intellectual journey through Rene Descartes' famous Meditations on First Philosophy. These lectures include an introduction, Meditations 1 and 2, Meditations 3 and 4, Meditations 5 and 6, and a conclusion. So I invite you to grab a notebook and a copy of the Meditations if you have one, your favorite mug filled with your favorite drink, and settle in with me through December as we walk with Descartes through doubt, discovery, and deep reflection. This is Descartes December. I am Dr. Chris L. Firestone, and this is the Firestone Files. Enjoy. Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Firestone, Professor of Philosophy, and this is a series of lectures on the philosophy of Rene Descartes. Rene Descartes is arguably considered one of the most famous philosophers of all time, and certainly is among those most famous philosophers of the modern period. He initiates a massive turn really in philosophy, from metaphysics as first philosophy to epistemology as first philosophy. So you could look at Descartes' philosophy, and we're going to do that here in a series of 5 lectures, as kind of the focal point for a massive transition from metaphysics to epistemology. So we're going to have 5 lectures. This first introductory lecture is going to look at the preliminaries leading up to that massive shift that we find in Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. And then the next 3 lectures will zero in on the superstructure and the details of the meditations themselves, and then we'll have a concluding lecture trying to wrap up all that we've learned about the philosophy of Descartes. Well, one of the contextual things I think we must know is that philosophy had this very lengthy period of metaphysics as being first philosophy. This, of course, started with the Greeks. The first summative philosophers of the Greek period were Plato and Aristotle, and that really defines the Western intellectual tradition, along with the emergence of Christianity as the sort of formative features guiding the Western intellectual tradition for, nearly 2,000 years. Plato, of course, had argued that ideas were fundamentally real. You can destroy all physical appearances of things, but you can't destroy the idea that gave rise to them in the first place. This is true of tables, for example. There's a million different kinds of table. I could show you picture after picture of table, but you can't destroy the idea of tableness. You could destroy all the examples of table in the world, but table as an idea would still exist in the universal realm of forms. And so that idealism, the idea that the notion that ideas are fundamentally real, was Plato's conception and became a very important feature of many Christian traditions in the West after that. Aristotle, of course, famously argued that ideas must be wedded, if you will, to matter. Form and matter is fundamentally real and comprises what he called substance. And so Aristotle's called a realist, that the idea by itself has a kind of primordial reality, but doesn't point to a universal realm of forms. Rather, it points to the need to be formulated in matter to be a substance. And so we have Plato's idealism, where there's a universal realm of forms or ideas, and we have Aristotle's realism, says no, ideas need to be put into matter. And so we have these two analogies that emerged from the Greek period, that of the cave, where we are all caught in a cave believing that the world as it appears to us is ultimately real. But when we break the chains through contemplation, we realize that the universal realm of forms, the world of ideas itself, is the only thing that goes unchanged. Everything else is something is a shadow, something lesser than that fundamental reality. And Aristotle's analogy is one more of a craftsman who must take an idea and put that idea into matter, as a craftsman might take a lump of clay and make it into a great statue of some sort, or maybe a block of marble and carve into that some form, and then you will have reality. So these two features of the Western intellectual tradition, idealism and realism, work their way through the Christian tradition in the Church Fathers, culminating in Augustine, thinkers like Anselm and Aquinas, all the way through the Middle Ages, all the way to William of Ockham, until we get to the emergence of science, scientific discovery, astronomy, work of studies on the human anatomy, biology, blood, and those sorts of things that are beginning to show signs of the natural sciences being a kind of trustworthy, superior sort of knowledge. And this, of course, gives rise to skepticism during the early part of the modern period. And Descartes, being a good Catholic philosopher, is troubled by these things, as he thinks every religious adherent should be troubled by them, that science is somehow showing itself to have a great pragmatic utility. And yet philosophy continues to struggle between idealism and realism. Metaphysics is first philosophy, systems of thought that had carried a great amount of weight but were waning in their authority as free thinkers began to question whether or not these sometimes contradictory systems could in fact ground science and mathematics in the things that we were beginning to discover about nature. And Descartes is, of course, worried about that. He's worried about the fundamental tenets of the Christian faith and the inability of philosophers to ground almost anything in philosophical reasoning. And so the skeptics are beginning to rise, and Descartes is concerned, and he sets about to put philosophy, prop it back up. Now, in order to do that, of course, he is going to call for the fall of the old way of doing philosophy, of metaphysics as first philosophy. And in that means tradition and authority are out, free thinking, critical thinking, mathematical thinking are in. And so one way to think of what Descartes is up to in the early part of the Meditations is what I call the intellectual equivalent of the nuclear bomb. He's going to try to wipe out all past systems and start afresh on firm foundations, things that are indubitable. We're going to see that when we get to Meditation 1 and the transition to Meditation 2. I think now replaces authority as our fundamental way forward. It used to be with, say, Thomas Aquinas. He would always cite the great philosophers, particularly Aristotle, in answering philosophical questions. That is no longer going to be the case in the 17th century. They're not going to quote the old philosophers anymore. In fact, they're going to dismiss them full stop and look to establish epistemology as first philosophy to ask these fundamental questions. What is indubitably true about the nature of the world and my access to it? So Descartes is an interesting figure. He is going to initiate a massive shift, one that we're living in a Cartesian age, or, if you get to all the way to postmodernism, some postmodernists understand themselves as post-Cartesians. Descartes has that much influence over the modern period. So this is, I think, some important things to know. So what's animating Descartes' thought? One is mathematics and science. He is a mathematician and a scientist. But he wants to get to those philosophical foundations, which he takes to be so important to the establishment of the veracity of mathematics and science. He's also a man of faith. He's a good Catholic. He believes in the central tenets of the Christian faith, but he thinks that they are under threat. And they're under threat not necessarily because they can't be defended experientially. They're under threat because of their situated empirical nature. You see, if I don't have access to the Word, if I don't have access to the tradition, if I'm just a common man, how am I going to be convinced by proselytizing or some other kind of testimony? No, Descartes wants to use natural reason in order to convince the common person that central features of the religious life are in fact true. These include the existence of God, the existence of the soul, immortality, and so forth. And Descartes doesn't think you can just claim those things and give empirical arguments for them. In fact, empirical arguments, wane because what do we see more than anything else except death and decay? No, if you're going to get at those things for Descartes, you're going to have to do it with mathematical reasoning. You're going to have to do it with indubitable premises that lead to ineluctable conclusions and so forth. And that is going to be his attempt to start a search for the perfect new philosophical methodology that can put this ship, which is beginning to list, back upright again. And that seems to be a big part of what Descartes is all about. So there's this obsession with Descartes for knowledge, obsession to backfill the metaphysical assumptions that have proven themselves to be contradictory and so forth, and to put philosophy on right footing. Now, he is not alone. There are other thinkers during this period who recognize some of the same things. Francis Bacon being one of them. They are kindred spirits, one in Britain, the other in France, looking at trying to establish this perfect methodology. Bacon is doing it through empirical methodologies, what he calls idols of the mind that cloud empirical science and so forth, that he's trying to get rid of to establish a new methodology. And he's, along with Thomas Hobbes, will lead to a philosophical position that has hence been called empiricism. An empiricist wants to say that sense perception is that original foundation for knowledge. Everything else is built on sense perception. And this is what we get in thinkers like Bacon and Hobbes. On the other side of the English Channel, of course, is Rene Descartes. And Rene Descartes is a rationalist. He believes that empirical observation and scientific study are foundational in a sense, but along with them is this thing he calls a priori knowledge. That is, knowledge that is prior to experience. A posteriori knowledge is what the empiricists built this epistemic revolution on, but the rationalists built it on a posteriori knowledge and a priori knowledge. And a priori knowledge is knowledge that is quickened, percolating out of the very nature of reason itself. So in this revolution that Descartes will initiate, the material world also has an immaterial component. But if you look at it the way Descartes does, it is actually something more like the opposite. That is, there is this immaterial thing that we can come to know for certain that testifies to the veracity of the material world. And that's the kind of flow of the argument that Descartes will make in the Meditations, that once we understand that the mental world is the one that we know most immediately, and the extended mental world, the physical world, is something we come to know just as strongly, but subsequently in his methodological argumentation. So it's an interesting juxtaposition between the empiricists, Bacon, Hobbes, Locke, and the rationalists, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, and so forth. And that, of course, is going to work its way all the way to the famous philosopher Immanuel Kant, who in another lecture I talk about this trajectory. Okay, now Let's focus in a little bit here on Rene Descartes and the turn to his meditations on first philosophy. What have we established? First of all, epistemology is first philosophy. The question, what can I know? What can I be certain of? In order to really crystallize that and to be sure he's onto something, he will begin with a method of doubt. This is what we find in Meditation 1. In Meditation 2, he establishes the cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And that's going to be his starting point for certainty. In Meditation 3, he's going to give his first argument for the existence of God. This allows him in Meditation 4 to turn to reason, and the veracity of reason is really the heart of the meditations. In Meditation 5, he will argue a kind of second argument for the existence of God based upon the property of extension. And in Meditation 6, he gets to the mind and body nature of the human person, establishing what has hence been called the mind-body problem. And one of the things I'm going to argue in these short lectures is that the easiest way to understand Descartes' philosophy is thinking of it as one might think of an hourglass-shaped argument. The method of doubt established in Meditation 1. The existence of the self as a mental substance in Meditation 2. In Meditation 3, the existence of God. Then the question of reason and the establishment of reason as the standard of truth. Then the existence of God as an extended mental substance in Meditation 5. And from there you get the existence of the external world and thus the human being as an extended mental substance called the body. So you have this shape, this hourglass-shaped structure of the meditations where you have the self as a mental thing, God, reason, God again, and the self again as a mind and a body. And so you have this parallel superstructure in the meditations that's really important to recognize. In the very center of that hourglass-shaped structure is the question of whether or not reason is reliable. Rather famously, Descartes is going to argue that there are no noetic effects of sin. That is, reason itself is untainted by the fall, even though he's a Catholic Christian thinker. Reason itself is untainted by the fall. It's the will that's unruly, the passions that get ahead of us that cause the intellect to go astray. But if we have some discipline, if we just pull back for a moment, the intellect itself is in fact reliable. Descartes thinks this to be a kind of self-evident or intuitive truth, because if reason's not reliable, then how do we get to scriptural understanding in the first place? How do we reason and interpret in the first place? There has to be a sense in which we can understand the world. We can understand the Word. We can understand ourselves just by the faculties that we've been given. And so he makes that argument right in the center of the meditations. I'm going to suggest to you that that's really the center of the entire Western intellectual tradition. So that's when we get to Meditation 4, for example. Okay. Let's briefly here to conclude this introductory lecture look at the introduction to Meditations on First Philosophy. Who are the meditations written to? Well, Descartes says it quite plainly at the very beginning in the introduction. He says that these meditations are written to the dean and doctors of the sacred faculty of theology at the University of Paris. In other words, he's writing the meditations to the theologians. Why is he doing that? He's basically suggesting, I'm going to argue here, that there's a wave of skepticism coming. That science and mathematics are making great progress, that the old systems contradict each other and cannot bear the weight of the impending onslaught of math and science. And so, if theologians want to be able to convince the common man, if they want to be on par with the sciences as they are beginning to emerge, then they need to read the meditations, because there they will find proofs for the existence of God, the existence of the soul, the trustworthiness of sense perception, and so forth. And with those tools, they have everything they need to convince the common man of the truth of central religious convictions. So here we have, at the very introduction of Rene Descartes' Meditations, a clear statement of what he's up to. He wants to help the church defend its central religious tenets from the skepticism that's beginning to merge in the academy and other places. He says the church is convincing to the choir. It's convincing to, the tenets of Christianity are convincing to those people who have faith already. But there is this percolating, emerging secularization in the modern period that Descartes says we're not yet ready for. The world is changing. The Christian era of philosophy is in a sense over, and it needs to play in the sandbox with the same tools as the common man. And so Descartes' Meditations are supposed to be those tools, and he thinks he's tooling up theologians for the modern period. He wants to use natural reason rather than revealed tradition or the word and so forth. It doesn't mean that those things aren't true. It means that, kind of like we're going to see later on with the Lessing's ditch and so forth, that anytime you have testimony and written documents, they're always situated. They always require faith in somebody else. Descartes thinks that is not going to cut it in light of these advances that he's seeing. No, we have to have arguments from natural reason, and that's what the Meditations are going to provide. Hobbes argued that we can't even get God in mind, that God is kind of an extrapolation of sense perception. And Descartes says, no, I can think God intuitively. That doesn't mean I have proof for God. I'm going to have to develop that, and that's what he's going to do in Meditation 3. Same thing with the soul, that we all have this intuitive understanding of the soul, but proving its existence is not an easy thing to do, and Descartes, of course, is going to set out to do that in Meditations 2, and then again have that work its way out in the subsequent meditations. So Descartes is interested, he's motivated by religious consideration. He famously had 3 dreams in his youth. I think he was about 23 years old or so, and he had these dreams where God basically presents him with this need to establish a firm foundation for knowledge. And he begins to work that out the rest of his life. His conviction regarding his Christian faith, I think, is very important to him. But more than that, he sees, in a sense, science and mathematics with great promise. And he's going to try to take the methods of science and math and move them into epistemology and establish a new method for proving the existence of God, proving the existence of the soul, proving the existence of the external world. And this will be an indubitable foundation on which everyone can agree. Okay, is he successful? We're going to turn our sights in the next lecture to Meditation 1 and Meditation 2 to see how he establishes the foundations for this methodology, and then we will work that out in subsequent meditations and see how all of these things come to a final superstructure that has been so convincing to the Western philosophical tradition for several hundred years now. All right, well, that's it for now. Look forward to talking with you more in the next lecture. We'll turn our sights to Meditations 1 and 2. Bye for now. Thanks for stopping by to spend some time with me here on the Firestone Files. I hope today's reflections offered you some new insights and perspective on life. If you enjoyed the episode or found it valuable, I'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone you care about. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you? What challenged you? Or what would you like to hear more about in future episodes? Drop a comment below or send in your suggestions to the email in the description. Your input helps shape where we go next. This has been Dr. Chris Firestone. Until next time, keep asking the big questions. And remember, the kingdom journey is always best with your friends. Further up and further in. Bye for now.